Kevin said today's event is planned to take you through some of our key findings and recommendations from the remand thematic. We hope that you've had the opportunity to read the report either in its entirety or read some of the recommendations, and we will take you through those. Bob, who was the lead inspector, will take you through those. Both Helens will then speak, and we will have some time for questions and answers at the end. So we'd invite you to save any questions for the end, when we will have time to take those. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the people who are the experts on this, and I'm also looking forward to hearing them speak today. So I'm going to hand over to Bob, if I may. Bob, it's all yours.
Thanks, Sue. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to start things off by just taking you through some of the findings of this inspection. I'm going to be focusing on the community side of the work, and Angus from HMI Prisons is going to be talking about some of the findings in the secure estate. But before we go into that, just a little bit about the methodology that we applied here. In the fieldwork stage of it, we visited 11 youth justice services. We looked at 125 yacht cases, youth justice service cases. Ofsted worked alongside ourselves in HMI probation, and we did what we call 22 deep dive cases, where both Ofsted and ourselves in HMI probation went into the case in some detail. It was a mixture of mostly children remanded in youth detention, but we also looked at some children who had got bail, children who had been remanded in local authority accommodation, children who were near misses, if you like, for being remanded in youth detention. In the secure side, we looked at 3 YOIs, 1 secure training centre, and 2 secure children's homes. We also ran focus groups, both at a regional level, a number of regional yacht areas, plus the key national bodies you expect. So it was a pretty thorough look into the whole area of remand from start to finish. And in terms of the report, if you've had a chance to read the report, we've tried to take a sort of journey of the child approach to it, tracking the child's progress through the system, preceded by some look at governance and management. So I'm going to do governance and management first, and then I'm going to move on to the journey of the child. And that will be done jointly with myself and Angus as we track the children's progress through the system. As part of our methodology, I should have said we did a survey of yachts. We got 115 responses from yachts, asking a whole series of questions about the management of remand, the experience of remand, their approach, the services they delivered, the sort of numbers they had to deal with to get a sense. So we took a combination of both our findings in terms of the survey and our signings in terms of the field work. And what we found was that in terms of youth justice service management boards, yacht management boards, it's on the radar of some of the boards, perhaps just over half. We reckon we told in the survey told us 62 of the boards had discussed remand as a substantive issue at their management board in the previous 12 months. Now, for some areas, of course, they won't get very many remands, so it might not be high on their agenda, but nonetheless, it's a legal possibility absolutely everywhere. So first thing we sort of concluded was it's on the radar of some areas, but not everywhere. For some areas, they conceded that actually one of the core drivers of the discussion at the management board was actually the financial aspects of it. As people are probably aware, yachts are charged for time for children spent remanded in youth detention. And if you get a spike in demand, then that can have quite significant financial impact in yachts. So for some areas, there was a recognition that it was not necessarily about a children's issue, but more about the financial issue. It was probably a small number of areas, but nonetheless worth mentioning. The best practice that we saw in terms of oversight from boards was really an approach that took regular reporting that featured both data and case studies. It told the board members about the numbers, about analysis of who was being remanded, particularly focusing on disproportionality and ethnic disparities in terms of decision making, but also bringing to life the background, the history of the children that were being remanded. How did these children get into this situation where they had to be remanded in youth detention for their offending? So that combination that we saw strongest, and we've in our report we identified a number of areas where we thought that they had got that just about right in terms of data. Sorry, I should have. Another key issue for us was around policy and guidance for practitioners. Yachts had Yacht workers often had a great deal of access to good guidance. There was case management guidance produced by the Youth Justice Board. There was often local guidance. But for local authorities, children's services, and as sure people are aware, children who get remanded in youth detention have children in care status, there was actually much less guidance as to how that process should be managed. And that was a recurring theme, which I'll come back to over the coming slides. The route to care for a child who's remanded in youth detention is very different from the other routes to care. And so in terms of how social workers should manage that process when children have that status, very often they just didn't know what to do. It was for many staff, it was a rare event. It was a combination of a rare event and a complex event. And that meant that sometimes people just weren't sure what they should be doing. And sometimes it was just absolute basics. We found a few cases where children the practitioners just really didn't know what they were doing. It was such a rare event for them, they just didn't know what to do. Nothing for us was around, many people kept telling us that contextual safeguarding was particularly, as a concept, was particularly important in thinking about this group of children and what led to them offending, a real important framework for understanding this group. But what we also found was there wasn't necessarily a shared understanding, particularly around exploitation across agencies. And that was particularly obvious between police and youth justice services and children's services. I kind of looking at the same child and seeing very different things. And we quite often saw case notes, examples of decision making where the police officers perhaps dealing with the case just were not sympathetic to the idea that this child might be being exploited or was subject to some other sort of adverse issues in their lives. And that was something that was really clear at a governance level. We quote one director of children's services in our report who told our Ofsted colleague, they described it as meetings with some of her police colleagues as like Groundhog Day, where they would agree resolutions about how things were going to be managed. There'd be a change in personnel. A different senior officer might take over the role and wouldn't necessarily be committed to the same sort of policies, if you like. And so you found having to quite often renegotiate and redevelop these relationships. And actually, we highlight some areas where they perhaps made some progress in overcoming some of these barriers, but it was a recurring theme throughout the field work. Okay, I'm going to move on to the journey of the child, starting with the police interview, charge, and detention. So, as I said, we took an approach where it was the journey of the child from police custody, and actually we talk a little bit about the offending that predates the police custody in the report, about court decision making, about the secure estate and what happens in the secure estate, and then the child's return to the community. And that was a kind of the framework, if you like, the backbone of our report and our findings. So a couple of findings around police custody. We've often found that yachts have seconded and linked police officers, and they were very good at alerting the youth justice colleagues to children in police custody. So youth justice services knew when children were in custody, and they knew almost as soon as they came in, it seemed to us. So the kind of early warning systems were there. It was a question really of what happened after that. So a couple of findings really. There's a document called the Concordat of Children in Police Custody, produced by the Home Office. People may be familiar with that. That identifies the option of Youth Justice Service yacht-supported police bail for children who are being investigated, being interviewed, and the police are considering what to do with. In a survey, we found that just 49 of the 115 youth justice areas provided that service. So that seemed to be a gap, and that pointed to some potential missed opportunities for children who were in police custody. People familiar with this area of work will know that children can be released under Section 38(6) of PACE, pending a court appearance, so that they don't have to spend the night in police custody or a weekend in police custody. HMIC FRS have commented this in the past, and we liaise with HMIC FRS over these issues, and there's very little use made of it in practice. We found that both in our survey and in our field work. It's just something that's not being used. We were interested in why that was. People told us a couple of things really around that the absence of suitable accommodation to place children overnight, and just simple practical issues around transport. How do you get a child perhaps late in the evening from a police station to a suitable placement? And in practice, people just weren't able to achieve that, and so children were spending time in custody. So as a starting point, going back to the very beginning of the system, there was potential, we thought, ways in which children may not have to be in police custody overnight, may not have to be held by the police to go to court, but could be released either by some form of bail through either yacht supported bail or 38(6). Most of our children that we looked at who we had the access to the information, children tended to go and make no comment at interview in these police inquiries. And that's understandable. Most people working with children will know that's very common for children in custody. But there were times when we did think that perhaps an admission of guilt might have made a bail more likely. And again, we explore that and produce some sort of analysis of why we think that is in the report. It's not something that's within the remit of any of the organisations that we inspect, but nonetheless, it's perhaps something that the Youth Justice Services could investigate in terms of looking at what the data they have available to them as to whether they can do something with defence solicitors at a local level about whether that's a good option for children. Let's go back to the general position around release from custody and so on. Our Ofsted colleagues found that often discussions between police, children's services around issues like release were pretty perfunctory and not often informed by the actual. There was assumptions and shortcuts used in the terminology and discussions that didn't actually match up with what the legislation says. So clarity, we had about one area where, because of that, they'd actually developed a script so that everybody sort of stuck to the proper legal processes and proper legal criteria for the decision making. So that was really quite useful, and we highlight that in our report. Okay, I'm going to move on to court now, and say some things about court. Again, a lot of findings here. The slides just pick out some of the headlines here. Just starting point, I referred a moment ago to children being released under this section of PACE. That means that they are not produced in court overnight from police cells, but in fact are brought to court by children's services because they've been released to the care of the local authority. What practitioners told us was that was a good thing, because they thought if the police were prepared to release a child to children's services pending the court appearance, the child was more likely to get bail the next day. In fact, interesting, the court's view was that wasn't the case. They would apply the legal criteria, whatever the circumstances of the release from police custody. So it was interesting to see a potential sort of difference in perception around some of those practices. We weren't able to test that in terms of the data, but it's something that perhaps is worth thought about for the future. Critical issue was around courts and joint court working. Increasingly, the number of youth courts has reduced, and increasingly youth justice services now share youth courts and work together. And what we saw was that the effectiveness of these joint working arrangements was really quite variable. That children the youth justice services didn't always work together effectively, and sometimes children would sort of slip through the net, so to speak. Now, what we found was that the children, I think we reckoned about a quarter of our sample, the child actually appeared in a court outside of their home area. So it was really critical that services that worked across border and that yachts could support children from their area appearing in an outside court. And what we found was that wasn't always working effectively. And we make a recommendation about some ways about thinking about how where yachts share courts, they can actually improve the working relationships. And probably the most extreme example we found was when we were talking to the youth custody service, who make decisions about placements for children who've been remanded in youth detention. And they told us that occasionally come across a situation where a child is peeing in court and no yacht will take responsibility for them. And we thought that was really quite shocking that situation could arise. Very rare event, but nonetheless, it shouldn't be happening at all. And based on some of the things we were seeing, we could understand how that might have happened. So a real sense that we want to see improved working relationships between yachts that share court and clear arrangements for cross-border issues. But clearly, the biggest challenges for children who are facing remand in youth detention is alternative accommodation, and that's critical to it. Now, again, we were kind of, in terms of this sample group and what we expected to find, it was perhaps slightly different from what we expected. A lot of our children in our sample had no previous convictions. We didn't expect that. That only about 25% of our total sample actually were offered a bail program by the yacht at the first court appearance. So in some ways, it was that surprised us. And we kind of tried to understand what was going on there, and we do some analysis of it in the report. And it seemed to us as a big issue around just unpreparedness, uncertainty about the children appearing on court. They weren't well known to services, perhaps charged with quite a serious offence. Some of them will ultimately be acquitted of those offences, of course, but they're charged with some quite serious offences, perhaps not well known. And so it felt like sometimes there was a sort of play safe, let them go to custody at the first appearance, and then we'll sort of work out what we can achieve and have them bailed. Perhaps look at some bail application later on. So a couple of statistics. Inspectors judged that 46% of the sample probably could have been managed safely in the community based on what they saw. Of that total sample, 26 were actually bailed at some point. So there's, if you like, a gap between, we thought 46, very rough figures, 26 were actually, as a group who we thought could have been bailed but weren't. For some children, of course, they actually declined. It's not the yacht that makes the bail application, it's the child and the child solicitor that make the bail application. And some children actually declined bail applications. So that was a factor for a small number of children. But on the whole, we felt that more children could have been remanded. And the key to that is about communication, about early warning systems, about children's services who are going to be most likely the providers of accommodation, potentially yachts who may know the child best, working effectively together to come up with some proposal for the child to be placed somewhere. And that was a kind of critical to it. I mean, we talk quite a lot about in the report about the ways that areas have achieved that, and some recommendations about some systems in place that might achieve that. Just a further additional statistic to that part of things was the number of remand. 17% of our remands we looked at lasted less than 7 days. So it was perhaps a Saturday remand where it might have been dealt with in adult court. And again, that's an issue that we highlight, is the need for both cross-border issues, out of hours, weekend court work, plus cross-border issues. Those are the children that kind of slip through the net. And our view was that those children should be possible to get more of those children in alternative accommodation rather than the secure estate. Okay, so that's my sort of just quick headlines of the first two parts of the journey of the child, the police custody and court. My colleague Angus is going to move on to some of the experiences of children in custody, and I'll actually come back to recommendations further on in this presentation this morning, where I'll say perhaps a little bit more about how we translated some of those findings into recommendations. So I'm going to pass over to Angus now, who's going to talk about the secure estate.
Hi. So We visited, as we've just heard, 4 sites. Ofsted visited 2, so we visited 3 YOIs, 2 STCs, and 2 secure children's homes, 3 YOIs and the 1 STC. And HMIP interviewed 38 children. I think we imagined we'd get 40, but 2 didn't want to speak to us. And we found several key themes as we did this work, talking to children, talking to their caseworkers, and looking at how they'd been treated once they were in custody. From really basic stuff, like children have very little knowledge, or could give us very little information about the reason they had been remanded. And nearly none of them had any idea why they'd been taken to a YOI over an STC, over an SCH, or vice versa. And while many of them could remember the judge or magistrate or yacht worker or barrister telling them something about why they'd been brought into custody, just one of 38 children was given written information. And the way this boy described it was essentially the barrister was in a rush, and so didn't have time to explain it verbally, so he got some written information about why he was there. So you have children who have come from court with little information about why they're there and why they've been placed in a YOI or an STC or an SCH, which is not an ideal situation. And I think the other theme that we found was that actually what a remanded child gets at any of those sites is really what that site does. So there's very little difference between what a remanded child will get at a YOI, STC or SCH and what their convicted counterparts get. So if it's a strong provision, like some of the SCHs that Ofsted went to see, they'll get a decent service. Whereas if that site is struggling, they will get a less positive experience. And broadly speaking, we found that the only notable difference in treatment once they got to custody between remanded children and convicted children was around sort of access to visits in YOIs, so they were entitled to more visits, although they couldn't actually get them because of the difficulties in conflict and the inability to provide the entitlement in some of these institutions. Access to their own money to spend on phone calls or items from the prison shop. So they got more visits and more of their own money in YOIs. And then in all sites, we found that there was a more limited offer in terms of offending behaviour programmes and other interventions. So something around addressing some children's behaviour. And I appreciate some children won't, they haven't been convicted at this stage, but in all of the cases there was behaviour, of these children that could have been worked on while they were in custody. So maybe an opportunity missed and something to reflect on there about what provision for remanded children looks like. The other thing that loads of children said to us, and it might not be something planning or elsewhere, is there aren't very many places to put children, and most children go to YOIs, so about 80% go to YOIs. There's only 5 of them, and it's difficult to keep in touch with their family and costly to keep in touch with their family as well. So families have to pay to visit. Not all sites are as proactive in advertising reimbursement for travel costs for families and friends. And remanded children have to pay much more than you or I pay for their telephone calls, phone in YOIs, to their family members, and they also have to pay to, or their family have to pay to send and receive emails to children in custody. And I think there is an issue there about remanded children and their sort of the barrier that creates to maintaining contact with their support networks in the community. When we look at planning, I think we found I know we found a really confused picture. Children are subjected to a smorgasbord of different planning meetings. The two that are most relevant here are the remand plan and the looked after children care planning systems. But just to give you an idea, a child will also be subject to something called a core support plan. They might be subject to an enhanced support plan in custody. They might be subject to an ACT if they're at risk of suicide or self-harm. If they're separated from their peers, they may be on a separate plan for that. And they may also have a custody support plan that they're working on with a key worker as well. And the cumulative impact on the child of all this planning was confusion. They couldn't articulate the difference between different meetings and the purpose of different meetings and different professionals to us, by and large. And while they knew YOI and STC based caseworkers, as well as their yacht workers more often than not, they couldn't really describe how the roles of social workers, yacht workers, and the institution-based caseworkers differed from each other. Planning, we found, was often based more about statutory timeframes rather than needs of children, which led to both some children getting too much and some children getting too little. So rather than more intensive planning for some and less intensive planning for others, who perhaps have been in custody for a long while and are relatively settled, we found that basically the statutory timeframes dictate when the meetings happen. And we also found a large absence of internal professionals at these planning meetings. So everything the child needs or gets in custody is not provided by the social worker or the yacht worker. It's provided by the institution in which they're held. But lots of these meetings, particularly remand planning meeting and looked after children meetings, don't have the care staff that are looking after the children day to day in there, so prison officers or youth justice workers in custody. They don't have teachers or healthcare staff from the institution at them, although they might have written contributions from the latter two. And what this meant is that actually, despite the resource placed in, on these structures, they often led to little discernible change in the day-to-day experience of children. So the child was finding it very difficult to work out exactly sort of what the purpose of some of those forums was. So there was a particular issue with the looked after status of remanded children. So remanded children have been looked after by virtue of their remanded status for some years now, but actually quite a lot of YOI staff and children reported that there was very limited input from local authorities where a child was simply looked after because of the remand status. They described a hierarchy of looked after children, with these children receiving the poorer service rather than the better service. Many children had a very limited relationship with their social worker, and we found that in the cases of these remanded children who were looked after just because of that status, statutory visits by social workers were rarely taking place, and if they were taking place virtually. And in reality, we found that the tangible benefits of being a child in care while on remand were limited to pocket money and the entitlement of support from a personal advisor when you turned 18. But even these were really inconsistently delivered. So we found children who were receiving nothing in terms of pocket money from their local authority, which made it very difficult for them to make phone calls while they were in the institution. And we also found people, living in the cell next door receiving £40 a week, which is probably a bit too much, a bit more on the generous side. So that was very inconsistent. and in some places, just the bureaucracy of getting money in prevented children receiving it. So at the STC, they would only receive it in cash or a postal order, which is almost impossible to provide if you're a professional. So there needed to be a system that would function. In terms of how children received healthcare and education while they were on remand, it was a sort of tale of two halves, where in terms of healthcare, they often received a good assessment and actually a better service than many of them had received in the community, quick access to appropriate care. Although some of the longer term interventions they might be excluded to because professionals didn't know how long they would be at the institution they were in. In contrast, education, we found that sort of opportunity of re-engaging children with education, while we did find that happened in some cases, in the majority we found that it was that the remand episode was very disruptive, both on the way into custody and on the way out. So we had half our sample, so 19 of those 38 children were in education before they came into custody, and they experienced delays starting education of up to 2 weeks in some institutions, which if you're only in for 2 weeks is quite a problem. We found that children were allocated to education in some institutions based on who they could mix with, so who they were not going to punch or be punched by, rather than their education needs. And you know, as an example, one kid neatly encapsulated this issue in an interview with us by saying, you know, if I get bail, it's going to be a waste of my life these past few weeks. I could have been doing my CSCS card, which I was doing in the community. I was getting full marks. I was supposed to be allocated to some multi-skills thing in the prison, but there isn't any room there. I don't want to get it all in place in here for me then to get bail tomorrow. It'll be a waste of their time and my time. And we found too much of this, where we found delay and then inappropriate allocation in custody, and then children then being released partway through some education provision for it to be discontinued in the community. We carried out the inspection during the exam season, and this highlighted some of the delays in communication with professionals. So professionals just not working on the same timeframes that the children needed them to work on. So we found children who were coming in, they were simply entered to exams that they were entered in the community. They sat them in custody, but they received none of the materials they needed to revise for or be taught the syllabus for those exams. In the worst cases, we saw the books and the revision guides being sent in the day after the exam was sat. We did find some good practice examples in terms of, I think Tower Hamlets had provided one-to-one remote teaching for a child who was at Oak Hill, which, you know, we have highlighted in the report. But again, as a principle, I'm not sure it's appropriate that these children have their education disrupted while they're spending time on remand. And then finally, we saw, as we look at returning to the community, so the next slide, we found real difficulties. So despite all the planning, we found that largely children were released in an unplanned and poorly coordinated way. So this was largely because that it was very unpredictable who would be released and when they would be released. So the professionals were unable to do anything other than scrabble together some accommodation and hope that they could get someone to meet the child at the institution to take them to a safe place. The things that were meant we'd like to see above and beyond that in terms of something for the kid to do, we found was sorely lacking, and actually even more so when these decisions were made later in the day. Those children who were eligible for personal advisors, or who had turned 18 in custody and now were eligible for personal advisors, we saw very little input from personal advisors, and we still do during our core inspection programme. But we did find some voluntary support for children who were acquitted provided in the community. So to sort of summarise the experience of a child going into custody, they came into an institution that, while some of them were operating well, those that were holding the majority of the children were actually were able to deliver a fairly limited offer for all children because of difficulties with conflict and staffing shortages. And we found lots of children, as Bob described, who were there for want of accommodation elsewhere in the community. And the impact of this group of children was to put additional pressure on already struggling institutions, making it more unlikely that everyone got what they need. So this issue at the start and in court is really, really important. But also the idea of continuing interventions that were previously being delivered in the community once children arrive in custody. So that's the end of my section. So I'm going to hand over to Samira from User Voice to take you through her findings.
That's great. Thank you, Angus. Okay, so hi everybody. As Angus said, my name is Samira. I work for User Voice as a lived experience consultant. And at User Voice, we're a lived experience charity whose aim is to give people a voice in the criminal justice system. So this morning, I'd like to present a brief overview of our recent report called The Voice of Young People for the Youth on Remand Inspection. So I was the lead peer researcher on the project, and we interviewed 7 young people in total. But I've chosen just 3 case studies to speak about today. We would have liked to have spoken to a lot more young people, but we did face some challenges in getting access to them. So one of the main barriers we faced was that many of the young people were in custody at the time, either as a child or as an adult. So these are the key findings from the Voice of Young People with Experience of Remand. So the 7 young people who we spoke to, they said that exclusion from school, not being in education or employment, mental health issues, and also being in care were just some of the main risk factors that could lead to their offending. So now we're coming on to case study 1. So this was a young man called Marcus, and he was of Black African heritage, and Marcus was 17 years old at the time of the interview. So at the time he was living at home with his mum and with his 3 sisters, and he described himself as feeling angry all the time. He told me he'd been expelled from school, and when he was arrested, Marcus said that he wished the police had treated him with a lot more compassion. And this is a quote. So he said to me, "I wish they would actually treat me like a juvenile and not a criminal." He said, "At the end of the day, no matter what happens, I'm still a juvenile. Do you know what I mean?" So Marcus said that he did feel his yacht worker didn't communicate well with him, and he found them unrelatable, which is quite sad. But Marcus also said that he felt like the youth justice system could have helped him more with education or employment. But he said that the legal advice he got was explained really well to him. So this was a real positive. So now we move on to Noah. So this is case study 2. And Noah started off with many variables that could have added to his risk of reoffending. So he spoke about having ADHD. He was living in care at the time. And he also has family members who have been in prison. And another quote I've got, he said, "My dad's in jail. I've been to jail before, my uncle's been to jail, my brother's been to jail. So I wanted to use this quote because I thought it was quite powerful to hear that, you know, all the people around him and his family had actually experienced custody. So you can see the pattern there. So Noah was expelled from school at 8 years old, and he speaks about having mental health issues as well. So when he was in custody, Noah felt that the care he received was inconsistent, and he said he felt confused by the sentencing process. He did tell me that some staff were really caring, but he said that others were more punitive. So Noah was really happy with the support he got from the youth offending team, which is a really positive thing to hear. He said that they helped him get into a different care home. And I think for Noah, this really made a massive difference to his life at the time. And Noah also said that his youth offending team worker supported him with his mental health issues. So again, that's a really positive thing to hear. Unfortunately, when I spoke about the police, he did say he had a really bad experience and was treated badly. So it's very different to his experience with his yacht team. Okay, so now we come on to Katie. So yeah, it was nice to speak to a female and to listen to her perspective. So Katie was 17 years old when she was interviewed. She said that she had lived with her mother and her sister, although the relationship with her mother wasn't good at the time. So Katie said she'd got into lots of fights at school and she was eventually kicked out. And she was in full-time employment when she was arrested, and she served 5 months at Oak Hill Training Centre. So a bit like Noah, Katie told me that there was a lack of consistent regime at Oak Hill. So Katie spoke about having to kick off to get the attention from staff that she needed. But despite her experiences with staff in custody, Katie again said she did feel really supported by her yacht worker, and the legal advice she had again was explained really well. So this is a theme that's coming through that's good. And Katie said to me, yeah, I think that they explained everything to me pretty well. Like at the time, I didn't actually understand the seriousness of the case, so I didn't actually understand what was going on, but they did make it clear. So again, that's positive. Okay, so we're coming to the last of my slides, and this slide is some peer-led solutions, and these are coming directly from the young people with experience of being on remand. And this element is really important for us at User Voice. So we are a solution focused, and we want people with lived experience to have a real say in what's being changed. So when we spoke to the young people, they said to us there really needs to be more people with lived experience that they come into contact with. They wanted more relatable staff and staff that were highly trained in important areas, you know, different areas of trauma, neurodiversity, those kinds of things. They wanted better communication throughout the service. Consistent regimes at training centres were things they were asking for. And also this came across as really important, that they wanted more reward for their good behaviour. So just to conclude, in January, I just want to let you know we will be speaking to some 18 to 20-year-olds, excuse me, who won't necessarily have been on remand, but we're going to be mapping out their journeys as well. So there's lots of more exciting work to come around this topic. So in a minute, I'm going to drop a link in the chat, and you can click on this link to read our full Youth on Remand report. And also we've got a report coming up about women on probation that might be of interest to you. So thanks ever so much for your time and for listening. And I'm going to pass you back to Bob now for some recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mira. In this report, we make 22 recommendations, which is a lot of recommendations, and I'm not going to go through them one by one, but just to say some things about the broad themes of the recommendations. But it's very much a cross-cutting set of recommendations focused on both national bodies, so we Department for Education, particularly Youth Custody Service and Youth Justice Board, and then also a local dimension to it around children's service departments, yacht management boards, police forces, and so on. And in making recommendations with around police activity, HMIC FRS were not actually formally part of the fieldwork of this inspection, but we did liaise with them throughout the inspection, and we cleared our recommendations with them before making them. So they are supported by HMIC FRS. Often, if you've seen the recommendations, it's actually several organisations might be caught up in a single recommendation, but that is the nature of remand. It's very much a cross-cutting, complex system, and it requires lots of people to work effectively together. So what I'm going to do is try and draw out some, rather than go through each of the 22 recommendations, draw out some themes on the next slide of the recommendations. So some headlines really from recommendations about understanding the characteristics of the children who are remanded in youth detention. Some of the case studies we read about were quite shocking, actually, in terms of the speed at which children suddenly found themselves from not knowing to a system to being involved in very serious offending that led to remand in youth detention. So it's small numbers, but we're recommending that areas, children's services and yachts together, where they have a remanded youth detention, they review the case and look for lessons that can be learned from that case, because it's some of the cases really told us quite a lot about services, gaps in services, the kind of critical moments in children's life, which Samir has just referred to, that lead to offending. Issues around effectiveness of multi-agency working and consistency, and particularly between youth justice services, children's services and the police, working together and having a shared understanding of the children that we're talking about here. That wasn't always the case. And so what you then perhaps had was agencies almost working against each other because they had different views as to where the case should go. And again, we give some examples of that, of what that looked like in practice in our report. But if agencies aren't consistent and don't have a shared understanding, they can't make an effective interagency response to this group. Set of recommendations around the provision of services. We talked earlier about youth justice services providing bail to children who could be on police custody. That seems to us an underused resource, and that's a kind of one of the first steps in terms of taking children out of a secure environment into a community environment. We also talked about the underuse of what we call PACE beds, where the police release children to children's services pending an overnight court appearance. It's about understanding what is there. Again, our report goes into some detail about some of the conversations that take place that really don't bear any reality to the legal framework that's in place. And so it's about making sure that there's a clear understanding between police, children's services and yachts about how those processes work. Directors of Children's Services talked to the challenges around accommodation for children, well-known problems for local authorities in terms of providing accommodation for children. And as directors of Children's Services were sometimes quite forcible with us and saying, well, we can't find beds for 4-year-olds, toddlers who we know well. The chances of finding a bed for a 16-year-old who's committed a serious offence who we know nothing about is extremely unlikely. But nonetheless, we did see occasional pieces of good practice where local authorities and perhaps yachts working together could actually come up with something that worked. Moving on to some of the national systems, haven't mentioned it in this presentation. I say there's a great deal more in the report, but some of the information exchange between youth justice services and the secure estate was quite weak because of some of the peculiarities of the systems and the way they're designed. There were sometimes gaps in the assessment of some of the children. Perhaps in certain circumstances, if a child's not well known to a yacht and has been remanded a long time, we can find ourselves without a proper assessment on file. And we saw that a couple of times. So we made some recommendations about how that information exchange system works between the different parts of the system. Clear finding. It's interesting, Angus talking about his findings there in terms of children in the secure estate. Ofsted were working in the local authorities, social care inspector talking to social workers, HMI prisons, looking at prisons work, secure estate work quite separately, and finding near identical findings without necessarily having to confer about just the lack of understanding around this looked after status, this child and care status that children have on remand. And as you said, that creates all sorts of problems, bureaucratic processes where social workers really don't understand what they're expected to do with these cases, and some surprises really. We thought, well, perhaps maybe the yacht workers and the youth justice services would provide briefings for the social work colleagues, often the part of the very same department, managed under the same structures, about what to do when you get a child remanded in youth detention and what the responsibilities are and what good practice looks like for that looked after status. But it just wasn't there. And so social workers were asked to take on pieces of work which they really didn't understand, and there was no one to help them. So a big gap in the practice there. And I think that requires both local and national responses to that in terms of social workers knowing what they're doing. And as Angus said, in terms of the secure estate, a need to streamline the planning processes between in the secure estate, multiple meetings taking place, and just a lack of clarity. I think multiple meetings not achieving a great deal sometimes. And this issue of access to social workers and families, quite shocking really, that a child who's in care has to pay out of their own pocket, with not even necessarily access to any money, to speak to their own social worker. Astonishing, really. So we've actually made a very specific recommendation around that, recognising that. But it's sometimes a question of the root cause of it was perhaps children's service departments not understanding their responsibilities for children in custody, children in secure estate, and assuming that these matters will be dealt with by the secure estate, and the secure estate assuming that the local authority children's social workers will be dealing with it, and neither was dealing with some of these issues, these practical issues of support. So a real gap in the in service there. So I say 22 recommendations. Just want to give you a sense of a theme of what's there from this slide, but do go back and have a look at them in some detail. So I'm going to pass you on now to, I think it's Helen, isn't it, for effective practice.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, so yes, alongside the report, we do produce effective practice guides, which really give us the opportunity to highlight and draw attention to the effective practice that we see on the inspections. So HMI Inspectorate of Probation's definition of effective practice is where we see our standards delivered well in practice. So what you'll see in the guides, if you haven't seen them already, is lots of information and tools for you and your teams to provide support. So within the Remand Effective Practice Guide, you'll find interviews with practitioners, managers, partners across a range of topics, focusing on things such as YGS promoting the voice of the children, information sharing, and reflective practice and partnership working. There's also links to expert organisations and further reading, which would really provide opportunities for you to reflect on some provided questions, which you can see on the slide there. And you can do that either individually or a team or as part of group exercises, and really using the guide as a toolkit. So within the inspection, we did see lots of effective practice. So I'm just going to go through a couple of examples with you now. So in South Yorkshire, we saw a trauma-informed approach in the form of custody intervention hubs in Barnsley and Shepcote Lane police suites. So trauma-informed approaches can be framed in terms of policy and people and place and practice. And with regards to place, it's really important that we can create an environment where children and adults are able to really engage with assessments or referrals or rehabilitation or supervision in an environment that isn't triggering. So this is quite a challenge for the criminal justice system, as we know, because of the space we have available, and making sure that we can consider the layout and the kind of the format of spaces. But what South Yorkshire Police did was engage with partnerships, particularly the NHS, to think about the colours in the room. They decided that the furniture wouldn't be bolted down, for instance, so there's the ability to move the furniture around to really kind of create that space for children to engage. And what they have found is that children are better able to build working relationships with professionals or trusted adults, and they are able to engage with assessments and referrals better. And currently 84% of children in custody engage with the liaison and diversion team within these suites. Another example there on the slide is the roundabout service in Sheffield. So Sheffield YGS did commission the roundabout service to work with them around accommodation provision. So Roundabout is the largest charity working with accommodation in Sheffield, and the contract currently expects that they will have 11 properties available for children and young people at all times. So the service is available for children and young people over the age of 16, and they are supervised by the Youth Justice Service. So the accommodation can be used as possible alternatives for remand. Or if a child's already in custody and there's no accommodation provision available, the contract can be used to consider bail placements also. Roundabout will support all young people regardless of risk, providing that there's a robust risk management plan in place and that it's assessed that the risk is manageable. And they also provide an accommodation worker whose remit is to kind of be that conduit to deal with accommodation queries, be a link between families and other professionals. They can also support with longer term considerations in terms of accommodation with young people. And they also will provide non-accommodation needs in terms of things like benefits and GP registration also, so can assist with that. And also quite importantly, they're not bounded by any timescales. So once a young person's completed their work with the youth justice system, they will continue to work with them as long as that person needs that support. So we also, we spoke with Rebecca Hammond, an adult safeguarding manager in Kent, who told us more about the transition workers that they have there in that continuity of care and support package. So the transitions workers were first introduced as that continuity of healthcare from custody to community. They are employed by the local authorities and they're based in HMP YOI Cookham Wood, but now they've widened their remit. So what the transitions workers can do is things like developing a shared case formulation and action plan with when a child enters custody. They also support children as they transition from custody to community. And one of the main pieces of work that they really focus on is looking at the trauma-informed work that started in custody and ensuring that any community-based intervention complements that as a child moves into the community again. They will also, if a child or young person moves from the youth estate to the adult estate, they will also support that transition. And they have been also working with children and young people to create the guidance around strength-based effective practice for resettlement. So really engaging with the young people around what it is that they feel that they should have access to and what they need. So that's really kind of, again, hearing the voice of the child that we've mentioned in other slides. We also saw lots of excellent case examples during the inspection. And this example here on the slide is about meeting the needs of a foreign national child. So the cultural considerations for this child was really key in building trust and intervening effectively with the child, because the child wasn't known to the Youth Justice Service or the Children's Social Care at the time of remand. So things that were put in place were, for example, translation equipment was provided to the child so the child could fully engage with meetings and help to understand the processes. They also sourced and provided magazines in the language of the child, so just to try and create a bit more of that, I guess, making that environment a little bit more comfortable and having access to some reading material. They also advocate for the child to be moved onto a wing where they would have access to staff who were from a similar background or spoke the language, which again really opened up opportunities to engage, share information and help that young person engage with professionals. And in the initial planning stage, the practitioner also advocated for the child to be moved to an area that was closer to home to maintain those family links and also the links with the youth justice worker. So all of that work really contributed to a really good assessment and planning stage while that person was on remand and engaging the child. So have a look, if you haven't already, on the website at all our, this EP guide, but also all the other products that we have available. And, if you have any queries, you can contact me direct around effective practice. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand over to Sue, who's going to lead the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks to all our speakers for being such good speakers and giving us the message, but also for keeping to time. You've all done really beautifully in keeping to the agenda, which gives us just short of half an hour for questions if we need it. So I'm going to ask everyone, if they don't mind, to turn their cameras on, particularly if you're intending to ask a question, because I'll also ask you to use the raise hand function on Teams so that I can make sure we select you in the order in which you've asked the questions, and also so that I can direct the question properly to the right person. That's great. Thank you so much. So we've got time for questions. If you put your hand up and ask the question, I'll then direct it to the best person to give you the answer you need. So over to you. Anne Snowden.
Hi, morning everyone. So I'm Anne Snowden from HMPPS. So I'm currently working on a whole agency policy. So that's prisons, probation and YCS, looking at modern slavery and human trafficking. Part of that's going to be around how we identify, support and protect individuals from re-trafficking. So in your earlier slide, I think one of the first slides, you said there was a lack of shared understanding of exploitation across agencies. So I'm just wondering if there's anything else that was found in terms of identifying children on remand who may have been criminally exploited, or you know, who could actually make use of the Section 45 defence in terms of before their sentence, and the support that they could potentially get from the NRM at that stage.
Bob, do you want to come in and answer that?
Yes, we identified, I don't have a statistic to hand, but we did actually check to see how many of our cases we looked at were subject to an NRM, maybe national referral mechanisms. That's a process for children who may have been exploited, can be circumstances can be considered. Again, there's a case study actually of in the report, practice example, where I'm afraid it's a classic case of the youth justice workers being really concerned about exploitation, and we refer to police response officers. The officers are actually dealing with the offence, not being particularly sympathetic. So I think it's I guess a classic case of perhaps the frontline officers not being up to speed, if you like, with some of the thinking around the nature of exploitation. But I think when this is one of the reasons we're keen on this sort of case study approach and the review of lessons learned, because it seemed to us that the exploitation was such a big factor in the children being forced to carry weapons for other people and things like that, being involved in drug supply in some way, that really they didn't have a lot of choice given the sort of sheer terror they were under from within the community. So I guess for us it's about just understanding the extent to which that impacts on some of the children we're talking about here in terms of the circumstances that led to the offence, and that lessons learned approach seemed to be one good way of disseminating what was happening, you know, the children's own experiences of those issues.
Thanks, Bob. Any other questions? I know some people had put some really interesting stuff in the chat. I don't know whether any of the people who put stuff in the chat wanted to elaborate on any of that, or just make any comments. Any of the comments or questions? Kathy, yeah, you'd put something in the chat, I think. Kathy Hampson.
I think we just see a recurring theme of the police not dealing with children, certainly in a child first way. And since in 2015 they published their child friendly policing document, it seems a long way down that road for us still to be having problems with policing and the police reactions to children, disproportionality issues, all of those kind of things. And you know, how can we deal with this, because we're finding that in our current research as well, that it's still ongoing. Any thoughts?
Bob, do you want to start off again?
Again, it's very difficult, but it does seem to be sort of almost intractable, this issue. And of course, I guess it's the colleagues at HMIC-FRS in terms of inspectorates that would have the most impact on policing. It's how you translate those intent to the front line, and that seems to be a perennial problem. I mean, all we can do is, from the point of view of the agencies that we inspect as part of this inspection, is to kind of build the evidence, turn it into real life stories of what's happening in these children's lives and disseminate it and try and get an understanding of what's happening in children's lives. But yes, I would agree, it does seem to be intractable. I should say that we do have to be careful, though, that it's not, to demonise the police. We were very interested in the issues of disproportionality throughout the inspection. In the detail of the inspection, there's a great deal of detail here, but there's one area where we did identify, for example, in youth justice services, the data we had from this inspection told us that if you were a white child and the yacht was making a recommendation as to where you should go for your custodial remand, you were probably more likely to be recommended for a secure children's home or secure training centre than if you were a black child. So there's little bits of bias that permeate the system, and it's not a case of people working in youth justice sector saying we've got all this sussed and it's somebody else's issue. I think every agency has to do their analysis and take a hard look at some of the thinking. But it's quite detailed. It's in the report, but it's a short section on recommendations for secure estate placement, which does suggest some biases in the thinking, and that is yacht workers. There's no police have no part in that. That's entirely down to youth justice workers, that decision making. So it's just that reminder that it's right across the system.
Thanks, Bob. Oshie Johnson.
Hi,
Hi.
my name's O'Shea. I just wanted to ask, I'm currently doing a bit of research around the possible introduction of PAVA into the YOI estate. So I just wanted to know if any of the young people that you spoke to had mentioned the increase in levels of violence that they'd experienced throughout their time on remand, or the impact that this had had on them and their emotional state whilst they were actually in custody on remand.
Bob?
Is that
Sorry
maybe
to
Angus?
pick on you again.
I wonder if that's Angus.
Or it might be, is that one for Angus?
I'm happy to give it a go. So violence in YOIs and the STC that is a sort of pervasive issue. So lots of the sites are characterised by conflict and the sort of inability of children who dislike one another to be out at the same time as each other, and that sort of web of conflict is quite debilitating and is at the heart of why a child who comes in on remand and needs to do level 1 English might not get to do level 1 English. So there was lots of talk about conflict and mixing throughout this inspection, as there is every inspection of YOIs and STCs. Very little conversation about PAVA because it's not currently in operation across the YCS estate.
I think that's right. Can I just add to that and just say, I've governed a YOI some years ago now, but I don't think children's behaviour changes that much. And there is the stats show you enormous high levels of violence in YOIs, but actually it's low level violence, if I can call it that. With some exceptions, it tends not to be stabbings and boiling water, the stuff you would see in an adult prison. It is sort of fisticuffs and so on. And everything we know tells us that the more you lock people up, the more you lock young people up, the more potential there is for them to irritate one another, to shout out of windows, to bully, so that when eventually you have to open them up, they've got scores to settle, and it's a real negative sort of cycle of behaviour. I think it's obviously hugely emotive, the idea of using PAVA with young people, and you know, it would be hard to argue proportionality in when you look at some of that violence. So yeah, I would be surprised if, you know, any reasonable person would see that as proportionate. But Angus is right, it stops other things happening. You know, you know, you can guarantee the alarm bell will ring 2 minutes after young people are unlocked to go to education, and they don't get there, and all of the harm that does. So it's massively difficult. You know, thank goodness people are thinking about it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I'm just looking for
in the chat, Sue. A couple of questions in the chat. So
okay. Oh,
Jennifer,
I'll go to Joy, and then I'll go and look at the chat. I don't want to put people on the spot if they've put things in the chat as an alternative to being in the spotlight. But if we go to Joy first, I've got 2 pages to flick through. So Joy Malloy.
So my question, I would say over the last sort of 18 months, 2 years, we've seen, and it's not just for children on remand, but for children in general, tend to be accused of the more serious offences. We seem to have seen a increase in the length of children being on bail or IUI'd, etc., because of general police resources, CPS resources, etc. And I just wondered if I didn't note it in but obviously the longer a child is on remand, the more impact it's going to have. And I wondered if that came up with any of the groups.
Bob? Or is that Bob or initially?
Should I start it off? Angus may want to chip in. I mean, yes, clearly there was some very long. I mean, sometimes we see people on remand for over a year and then acquitted at the end of it. I mean, it's just incredible that a child should be locked up for, you know, it's a significant proportion of their lives is spent in custody, and then suddenly acquitted. And you think, how on earth can that happen, and can that be right? I mean, from the point of view of I guess the narrow focus of this piece of work, it's about, well, what can we do to stop those remands happening in the first place, so that they are not locked up, sometimes completely unnecessarily, for lengthy periods of time, and what can be done. And that's, I think, you know, a lot of the focus of our work really here is about stopping the remands, stopping those unnecessary remands, and stopping these, you know, anomalous cases where such lengthy periods only to be acquitted.
Yeah. Angus, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we found cases of 700 days on remand in a YOI, 500, I think, in an STC, and that's just pure luck. I mean, in terms of, we could go this week and it'd be the other way around. It's but my view on this is very, very similar to what you've just heard with Bob. There is a place for remanding people into custody in the system. You need to make sure you're not doing it because you've got nowhere else to put them. So get rid of the short remands, and you need to not make the remand into a 2-year process, or, you know, and have a real handle on those time limits. If there was some success with that, then some of the other issues we've just heard about in terms of managing conflict would be a touch easier in a population that was lower. These children make up 45% of the YOI and STC population, and if that was reduced, they would be relatively easier places to run.
I'm just asking a question from me. Presumably the custody time limits that have taken a hit during COVID, we should start to see some recovery, shouldn't we? We should start to see some of the sort of re-emergence of the time limits, which did get rid of some of those very lengthy periods of remand for a while. I mean, it's as bad as it's ever been now, isn't it? Largely because of COVID and court backlogs.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if in our area it is an issue with the court so much as the police and CPS.
Oh, okay.
I think our courts recovered fairly quickly, and we put in quite a robust process to manage our youth through the court more quickly. So I'm not sure the delay is coming from court. I think it's the other areas.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, Alex Chard.
Good morning. I've put this in the chat as well.
Okay.
Morning to everyone. I think the team has to be congratulated on lifting the lid on what's happening to this very vulnerable group of children. I think personally, these findings are deeply disturbing. The likelihood is that these are highly vulnerable children. There's a significant overrepresentation of poor children, racialized children within this group of children. And what we seem to be seeing is systemic failure. That's how I've taken what's been presented. I'm particularly disturbed by what Angus was saying. I'm very interested because of my own research. Did you actually investigate the needs profile and history of these children? Because I suspect you could show they were highly vulnerable children in the vast majority of cases. So interested from any of the inspectors in terms of the needs of this group of children.
Bob, do you want to start again and then hand over to Angus if he wants to add?
Morning, Alex. Thanks for that question. We in previous inspections, we have looked at some of the detail of the histories of these children. We didn't do it particularly on this one. The focus was really on that system, but what became apparent on decision-making system around remand and each of these bits of process and how they work. But you couldn't escape it. So although we didn't go digging to see what the histories were, you couldn't escape it because it was so prominent. The kind of children describing children carrying knives for their own safety. They felt they had to carry weapons for their own safety because they didn't, then they would just get stabbed by somebody else. And that kind of escalation of almost an arms race between children as to how they had to live their lives to be safe was really quite shocking. And again, I've said this already, that's why understanding the characteristics of these children is so important. We didn't do it particularly on the field work, but our feeling is, having now done what we've done, we think local authorities should really understand the histories of those children and some of the sort of points in their lives that lead them into the situation that led to the remand. Sometimes it's as simple as exclusion from school, but the circumstances that might have led from that exclusion from school can be really quite horrific. Some unjust decision making, perhaps, in their lives that's created this sort of downward spiral. And so it's really critical, and it's important, and that recommendation is about is just understanding the history of those children and some of the trauma that's impacted on them.
Thanks, Bob. Angus, do you want to add anything to that?
Just to say that, I mean, in custody, you're absolutely right that they're the children that I meet. I meet poor children, I meet black children, I meet Asian children, and I very rarely, I can think of one middle-class child that I met in the 9 years I've been responsible for inspecting places holding children. I think we have to acknowledge, though, about the some of the offences that people have been accused of and or convicted of in these sites as well. So there is some of this about decision making in the process and making sure that only the children that society accepts should be put into these places are. But there is a need to work out what system is necessary to meet the needs of very vulnerable children with multiple needs who have committed very serious offences, and that's the conundrum, because they are both very vulnerable and very risky all at the same time.
Yeah, thanks, Angus. We've got a couple of other questions in the chat which I'll read out in turn, and perhaps somebody can pick these up. One from Jennifer Butler saying, did the inspection find geography bias, whereby children from urban metropolitan areas were denied bail in more other areas? If this is happening, what would be a recommendation to address this? Bob, do you want to answer that?
We didn't go looking for that particularly, and it wasn't obvious to us. I mean, sometimes the urban areas were actually more geared up to the needs of children from minority groups and had just better able to understand and recognize. So we didn't see any examples of that. Because of the nature of the fieldwork, we had to go to places that had significant numbers of children remanded. So there was a bias towards urban areas in our sampling and in our field work. So quite what happens in those rural areas. We did some focus groups. It wasn't clear to us, but there clearly is some biases in decision making. But it's not necessarily an urban rural factors to that. That wasn't the most obvious one, but I'm sure there will be individual cases where that will be the case.
Thanks, Bob. And another question from Jane Brown saying, I was struck by the findings in relation to poor assessments and gaps in knowledge of yacht practitioners. Do we think this might be related to yacht caseloads being predominantly focused on prevention and diversion casework, leading to some de-skilling? Bob,
interesting
again.
question. I mean, as I said earlier, it's rare but complex events. And if you're dealing with these cases, and maybe some of the biggest urban authorities would be dealing with children on remand fairly frequently, and so would have developed the expertise. But if you weren't used to dealing with these sort of scenarios, there was often a case of having to go back. So some very basic errors we saw of not understanding the need to be involved, for the youth justice cells to be involved because the child was remanded in local authority accommodation. Another one where the remand and youth detention had ended, but the yacht worker hadn't told the social worker that the care episode had now ended. So little things, just little basic errors, which we just put down to, I say, calling through the net of knowledge, if you like. There is good guidance available to yacht workers. It's really about frontline staff and frontline managers just being on top of those cases and showing the degree of oversight that's required. Whether the preventative and early intervention work they do distractions from that, I wouldn't be really in a position to say. But it is, I think it is, we do stress the importance of staff understanding this stuff when it comes along. And it's about recognizing as an organization, how do you manage rare but complex events? How do you make sure that staff have access to the information that they need when these events that might only come once a year actually have to be dealt with?
Thanks, Bob. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left. Oh, Teresa, you've just put your hand up just as I was about to offer the last question to somebody. So you're the winner.
I can see that Dr. Oxford also has his.
I think that's left up,
probably
left
a legacy
from before. I think so.
Yes, well, good afternoon all. So I'm Teresa. I work for Lambeth Youth Justice Service. I work with a young person in the past who was on remand for over 500 days actually before he was sentenced. And during this period of time, he turned 18 and he transitioned to the adult state. We've noticed then that a complete drastic reduction in the communication with the adult state and the fact that he was on remand. He didn't have an allocated probation officer, so there wasn't really a planning around his remand, and he really voiced about his frustration being locked up in his cell for most of the time for over 20 hours, not really having a plan, and being mixed as well, obviously, with adults for very serious offence. He was also charged with a very serious offence. But feeling that was really a detriment to his mental health and how to cope with that. And I'm just wondering really what is the focus and the recommendations from I think from these findings in terms of those children that find themselves within that I think within that gap, the transition to the adult state, and add to the fact actually to this young person that because he was involved in a group offence of actually over 12 people, it means that the case was then moved over to one of the super courts in Nottingham, and so he was just right before the crucial time of his court proceedings to the trial to a completely out of area with no support in place. It was luckily that actually we've managed to engage with the local YGS team who accepted the transfer of an 18-year-old and actually seeing them in the court as well with us traveling there. But felt that obviously there was very little provision for him at this in this period of time. So just wondering what is the focus and the recommendations for the children in the transition to adult state.
Yeah.
Bob?
Should I start off with that one? I'm not sure if we make an actual specific recommendation. There's a short section in the report about transition. About a third of the total sample that we looked at were now 18, so we could see what was happening to them. And I mean, not surprising, it was a bit of a mixed picture. Sometimes that transition ran fairly smoothly. It seemed to be that the yacht probation officer was critical to that transition happening effectively. But in fact, quite a lot of yachts have got gaps in the probation officer secondment, and so they don't actually have access to a seconded probation officer, or it's a fairly limited access to. But that seemed to be us to be critical, was that role of that seconded probation officer. It was complicated. We saw cases where children would have simultaneous offences in both youth and adult systems and across boundaries, so it got extremely complicated in some cases, and it was very difficult to piece together. But it seemed to us that the yachts and the seconded probation officers were pretty critical. There was also some just again, we talk about some failings of understanding. We talk about a poor practice example where a child was committed some offences after he was 18, but he hadn't been transitioned to probation. Probation wouldn't take the case on. He was stuck. Yacht was stuck with him as an adult, and so it got into sort of a mess, really. So that probably happened a bit more often than it should have. But certainly, seconded probation officers are the kind of key to trying to smooth out, I would say, some of these transition and communication issues.
Thanks, Bob. We've got 2 minutes left now, so I'll use those 2 minutes to thank all of you for coming and for participating and for asking such great questions. Thanks to all our presenters. Thanks to Bob for leading this important inspection. We've got somebody's put their hand up at the very end. Keisha Emery, I can't see you, but have you got a quick question or a comment you wanted to make?
Yeah. Sorry, I just want to say thank you. That the whole thing was very sorry, I just lost the words. It was very informal. But I just wanted to ask, do you know, I've heard like a few people say, like the solicitors say, that they have to like wait for a Part B for people to get like parole or to get bail or something like that. I just wanted to know like what that Part B is. Like, you know, that Part B, like they have a Part A and a Part B. I don't know, it's something to do with probation. Does anybody know what that is?
Is that a quick answer, Bob? Do you know?
I think we'd probably maybe email.
Yeah, do you want to email us, Keisha?
And we'll have a look into that. I suspect it's probably a little bit more, quite a little bit of digging just to be absolutely clear what we're talking about here.
I heard one of the solicitors saying, "Oh, we're waiting for probation to do the Part B and stuff like that."
If you email us your question, Keisha, we'll give you a fuller answer.
Thank you.
Definitely. All right, lovely. Thank you. So thanks everybody for coming and for supporting the work that we do, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you.